If you've taken the basic endgames course here on Structured Chess Training, you'll remember the section we dedicated to passed pawns, different types of passed pawns, and mostly how they work in pawn endgames, and maybe some endgames with more pieces, but mostly restricting ourselves, of course, to the topic of the course, which was endgames. Here, we are gonna keep all of that in mind, but also focus on the influence a passed pawn can have in the middle game or even in the opening, earlier stages of the game. So as a quick refresher, let's see what a passed pawn is. So for instance here, black has these two pawns against white's one, so no passed pawns here, because remember that a passed pawn is a pawn that has no opposing pawns that could either stop it or take it. So if this pawn kept pushing by itself, eventually it would get captured. Similarly, if this pawn started to push, eventually it will find this opponent and it will have to stop. Of course, black could convert this into a passed pawn eventually, but there's still some work to do. There's no passed pawn yet. Meanwhile, this black pawn on d5 is a passed pawn because he can simply push as far as he wants and nobody is gonna stop him, or at least no enemy pawn. White would have to dedicate a piece to either blocking it, controlling it, whatever. But on its own, the pawn would simply run into promotion by itself. Then here we have two connected passed pawns. That is, well, a very a very strong factor in endgames. It can very quickly decide a game having these two pawns together, because they can support each other in their journey towards promotion. So it's not just a lonely pawn that could become weak. If you think about it, this is an isolated pawn. But these two pawns are not only passed and connected, they can also protect each other in this way or in this way and help towards promotion. And then on this side of the board, we have something similar, which is a protected passed pawn. So this is a passed pawn. It can run freely towards the edge of the board, and it's protected by a fellow pawn. But this pawn isn't passed. This pawn is blocked. So it serves as protection right now, but in the future, maybe this pawn has to walk alone by itself. Okay, so with these concepts in mind, let's start with our first example. And I will show you this position, and you may be asking yourself, okay, but where's the passed pawn here? It's black to play, and I'll let you find the move that ends up creating a passed pawn from this position. Take your time. Okay, so maybe you thought about pushing these pawns over here, and yes, we can create a passed pawn like that, but it's probably going to be weak and very easily blocked. So we have to look for a tactic here. We will exploit the ping on this pawn. If this pawn were to move, this would release this attack. So black played here the move bishop takes a3. Still no passed pawn, but we're threatening to capture on b2, and this would eventually indeed create the passed pawn. No? If white did nothing, we could maybe even take with the rook and trade everything and have a free way to promotion. So white should either defend somehow, maybe a move like rook to d2, but it's quite passive. And so what white did instead was go for a counterplay. And they play the move pawn to f5. So what's going on here? What's the idea? Well, after black retreats the bishop, so they can push a3 and now indeed create the passed pawn, as this pawn is still pinned. Now white can create some counterattack. So they can take and maybe play rook f3, opening either queen d3 to attack here, or queen a6 to block the pawn and also attack here. So yeah, rook f3 is a great move for activation. Black ignores all of that and pushes the pawn. White goes queen d3 and black defends. Even though let's later see the alternative, queen a6, but for now let's focus on the idea white played, they attack, they create an attack, so black has to take. This leaves white with also a passed pawn, a protected passed pawn indeed, but yeah, they are an exchange down. If this knight could somehow come to this square, to e5, then this would be devastating, but there won't be enough time. So black played king h7, now the queen comes to a6, and I'll let you find out in this position what is the right way to create a passed pawn. So should black capture with the rook here, or should black capture with the pawn? Which one is correct? Okay, so if they take with the rook, with the idea of taking, now taking with the queen, black king can move not here, because then black can trade queens, and that would be bad, but maybe to this square, to g1. And now I let you analyze it by yourselves. Black has no way to stop the perpetual, so either they have to give up this pawn, or if they push, then simply queen a7 and a bunch of checks. In fact, this would indeed be mate, right? Because there's queen g7. So yeah, black has to go on the defense or just give a lot of checks with the queen, and they can never force a queen trade. So yeah, this is a bad idea. Instead, what was played in the game was just capturing on a2. Note that these checks are still not an option. So if white takes, now black can promote, and this check can be stopped easily. So what white tried in the game was to take on c6, but now black wins easily with a nice tactic, which is a discovered attack leading to promotion. So like this, you can see that white is now in check. And well, after this move, queen e4, notice the ping, and white resigned here. But let's go back a few moves. Let's explore now the move queen a6. And this is why it's important to control the passed pawn. So here, there isn't really a great move for black. So they cannot take, and they cannot take with the rook. So maybe after a move like rook f8, trying to stop the attack on the king side, they can simply take. And now queen a4 is a great move because it protects the knight. It stops a potential queen b1 that would release an attack while also threatening to advance the pawn. And so here, obviously, black still has an advantage, but there's still a game to play. So yeah, white should definitely have tried to control the passed pawn. Okay, so here we have a position. This is a game from Garry Kasparov. White just created a passed pawn. You can see this d6 pawn is well protected by the rook. It's starting to speculate with promotion. Let's rewind a few moves to this position where white played d5, and they exploit this tactic, well, not really a tactic, just the fact that the knight could be left hanging. So if black takes, sorry about that, if black takes and white takes back, they cannot take because the knight would be hanging. So this creates a passed pawn, but this gives the chance to take the c3 pawn with the bishop like this, right? So it's a pawn sacrifice. So bishop takes, the rook, as we saw already in the endgame scores, we wanted pushing the passed pawn from behind, so the rook is great on d1. And after takes, we reach this position with the passed pawn. So bishop g7 was played, d6, and now black tried f6, which makes sense, and that's the reason behind bishop g7, right? So if you go back a move, the bishop could be stuck. If we play f6 now, there's gonna be some trouble. So bishop g7 and now f6. And the reason is that the bishop is basically attacking the d8 square, covering it, and it would be impossible for black to block the pawn unless they do something about it. So let's say they play a move like knight b8 or knight b4 is really the same. The idea is to maybe block like this or come here and cover like this, something like along those lines. But white can simply ignore it, keep pushing, and there's just no way. So maybe knight here trying to cover the promotion square. We can simply attack the knight and it has to move. Against a move like this, notice now that the rook is in trouble. So how would you win material here? We would of course play bishop e7, right? So that's why in the game, black went for f6 because it annoys this bishop a little bit. And here Kasparov played an amazing move. And this is one of the things we gotta keep in mind with these passed pawns. It's not just the static advantage and the hope that maybe in an endgame we can convert it into a queen, but also the tactical details that appear from the passed pawn advancing. So that's why in the next example we will see that it's important to block the passed pawn, not just control the squares, but also block it, because then we can run into some sorts of trouble. Like here, Kasparov played d7, which is a great move, sacrificing the bishop, and after check, now the knight takes, and we can start to see some threats. There's knight f7 check that would win an exchange. So I hope you can see the smothered mate, right? If black does nothing, we have knight f7 against king g8. Can you see that now knight h6 would lead to mate, right? If not, analyze and check for yourselves and take your time. So another threat is knight e6, giving again an option to push. So yeah, black is already in a bit of trouble here. They did play a nice defensive move, which is bishop f6. So giving the g7 square for the king in case of this check, and also keeping an eye on the promotion square. So yeah, bishop f6 is a nice defensive move. And now white plays knight e6, attacking the rook. And black has to now basically give it up, so they cannot simply protect in any reasonable way. So let's see a move like rook g8. Let's maybe rook d6 or even queen f4, creating an attack on the bishop. So if the bishop leaves the diagonal, there's queen e5, and there aren't that many great squares for the bishop. So they're in a bit of trouble, right? So in the game, they decided to, okay, let's play knight c7 instead, offering the rook, but yeah, at least they would have a bishop and a knight for it, so maybe it's not that bad. White does indeed take the rook, and rook takes back. And now rook d6, which is a great move because there's a hidden tactic here, and as we saw with the d7 move before, we always have to be aware of tactics that would involve a promotion. So since that is a pretty strong move, if there's some way to get an advantage to it or use it as a distraction, we can create all sorts of trouble for our opponent. So in the game, bishop e7 was played. So if the bishop leaves this diagonal, white simply promotes, right? And the bishop has to move because white is threatening to simply take and promote. So yeah, bishop e7 seems sensible, right? Because we attack the rook and we keep the control on the promotion square, we remove the bishop from the danger. But what happens here? What did Kasparov play in this position? Well, he simply promoted. So why did he promote? If black takes with the rook, we can simply take, and now after this, when the bishop moves, we play queen f7. So doesn't really matter. Let's say they go to f6, they could go to any other square. We just go queen f7, and this is devastating. So black took with the bishop instead, but here you need to notice that the d7 square is now available for our rook. Since our pawn has gotten out of the way, we can now use d7 for the rook. So white played queen c3 check, and after the king moved, rook d7, and yeah, black has a lost position. There's just so many threats. So bishop f6 trying to stop the immediate mate, but there's queen c4, and now queen f4, and after queen a6 trying to maybe get some counterplay, some queen e2, something like that. Also being able to move the knight. Here Kasparov simply went queen h6, and the threats are just unstoppable. Okay, so what's the point of this example? The point is that we gotta be careful about the problems that a passed pawn can create with its advances. So if you notice back when we played the d6 at the beginning, the knight suddenly doesn't really have any good routes, and then d7, when it could seem that the knight can use the blocking square, we can now go d7 and make the knight useless again. So yeah, passed pawns must be controlled, restrained, or ideally blocked. That's the point. And when they're not, we have to be aware of all sorts of tactics that could appear and all the threats that could come from the pawn advancing. This doesn't mean that you should always advance your passed pawns at any occasion you got, because as we saw in the first chapters of this course, this is technically a weak pawn, right? If black went to restrain it and managed to attack it, this pawn would indeed become a target because it's isolated. So yeah, there's always this balance, but we have to think of this pawn as also an asset, not just a weakness, because it is a weakness, but it's also a passed pawn. So we have to find the balance between the goods, the positives, and the negatives. Okay, so let's go back. Let's go forward to the next example. And here we have this position. This is a game by Ninthowicz that he did comment in his book My System, which is an all-time classic. And here Ninthowicz was playing as black. And I let you think, take your time, take a few minutes to decide what would you play here as black. Okay, so there are several options. We can consider pushing this pawn, but this would leave a great square for the knight. That would be in an amazing position, so not ideal. We could play maybe bishop e6 to finish development, but this will be met with f5, which is so annoying. So maybe you can think, okay, let's play a5, so the bishop can develop this way. But yeah, this isn't ideal either. So maybe after normal moves like bishop a3, bishop a6, white can simply take, and push the pawn. And this can start to get a bit annoying with different threats, especially here in front of our king. So yeah, white has a great position here. You could also think maybe we should give this check, and this is not objectively bad. I think it's a good move. It's true that the king can go, and now white can play maybe through knight a4 and eventually bishop e3 and trying to take control of especially the weak square on c5, but maybe also here. Still, I think this is an objectively reasonable move, no problem about it. But instead of all of that, Nimzowicz played something that may look weird. He played f5. And you may be asking yourself, didn't they know in that time about passed pawns? Okay, like this is the 1910s, so maybe it was just a concept they weren't aware of. So is this move just, did they play this terribly? Are they out of their mind? And well, thing is, f5 certainly does one thing, which is stop all the deals with white pushing f5, right? So for instance, bishop e6 can be met with f5, and then maybe f6, even sacrificing the pawn to create an attack. So of course, not necessarily immediately, maybe they can go bishop d3 first. But this is annoying for black. It's stopping them from developing the pieces, and you can see that basically all the black pieces, except maybe for this bishop, they're all stuck. So yeah, f5 achieves that. But there's also one thing. This passed pawn, it cannot really push. So if it goes e6, it's captured immediately. And even if it couldn't, well, it cannot go any further than that. It will also release a great diagonal for this bishop here. So if this pawn were to push, we will bishop f6, or we can stay blocking it. Also, the d6 and f6 squares will be released for the knight. So it's not really bad news if the pawn advances. And also, most importantly, we can establish a blocker right in front of the pawn, meaning that it's not only that in this immediate moment the pawn pushes aren't good, but we will never ever allow it to move forward again. So bishop e3 was played, and given what we said, you may be expecting now bishop e6, right? Makes perfect sense. We place the bishop here. Now it serves a purpose. It blocks the pawn, and we can play with other pieces. But that's not what Ninthowicz played. Ninthowicz played a somewhat clever idea, and it's, I'm going to use a different blocker. And that blocker is the knight. So why do we want the knight to be on e6 rather than the bishop, even though it will take several extra moves? So we want the knight because from this square, you can see that a bishop, so like this, he will be kind of stuck, right? Like it doesn't have much movement. It can only go backwards or maybe here and then there, but they are not great spots. It's mostly blocked and trapped by the pawn chain. But now think of the option of putting a knight here, right? Think of a knight here. You can see that it controls many important squares, right? So c5 is controlled, d4 is controlled, even g5 is controlled. So from behind the pawn chain, it has an influence on the other side of the board, especially the center and the king side here, right? Whilst the bishop, if it's staring at a wall of pawns or two walls of pawns on each side, it has nothing else to do there. It's just staring at a wall. On the other hand, a knight can have some influence even from behind the wall of pawns. So that's why Ninthowicz tried to use the knight as a blocker. Now, white played the knight a4, which is a sound move. The idea being to occupy this weak square, of course. Black goes knight g7, completing the maneuver. And here, we can argue all day about this position. Bishop c5 to remove the dark square bishops could have been an option, but it won't achieve much because we don't do that. We simply establish our blocker, and if white takes, we take with the queen, and notice that now the knight can no longer go here, right? So trying to trade our dark square bishop doesn't achieve much. They went for queen d2. Of course, knight c5, we can take immediately, move the rook, and then play knight e6. That could be an option. It happens later on in the game. So they went queen d2, trying to connect the rooks, and yeah, maybe use this rook for something on either d1 or maybe c1 and c4, something along those lines. Black now played queen d7, which is a move I don't like. I think playing knight e6 straight away was better, but maybe they were scared of some queen a5 and they want to have an option to protect. I don't really know, but yeah, knight e6 is probably objectively just fine and easier to understand than queen d7. So white goes queen a5, putting some pressure here and here. And now, of course, what's the move that black plays? Black plays knight e6, so finally establishing the blockade. And it's important to note that on all the previous moves, the pawn push from white, so the e6 push, was bad. I guess Ninthowicz was really quite sure about it when he played queen d7, so there are no good sacrifices here. But yeah, that's why I really prefer to block straight away, because then we don't have to worry about the pawn push. We know it's no longer an option. Anyway, from here we get this type of ideal blocking position. white brings the rook into the game, and black plays rook d8, which is not a bad move. So thing is, in an ideal world, black would like to push these pawns, but you can see that the white pieces have a solid control of the weak square. They don't want to play b4 because this would leave the queen with very little play. They really shouldn't be speculating of taking here because the bishop will be left pinned and in a very dangerous spot. But still, they're doing their best to try to control these dark squares. So now white goes knight c5, and I want you to think, what do we do now? So white is playing logically, right? So they have this weak square where they can put a piece, and they want to break the blockade by removing the knight, and they're also attacking our queen. So we really gotta do something about it. What do we do? Okay, so this is a move that, yeah, maybe it's easier to make for a beginner than for an expert, because beginners are not really scared of the bishop pair. They think of knights and bishop as equals. More experienced players would be less willing to maybe give up the bishop pair, especially the dark squared bishop. Maybe they want to trade this passive bishop, but this not so much. Daniel played bishop takes c5, which is a great move because now the knight is really happy that the enemy knight is gone. So this bishop will never ever be able to attack it unless they play some terrible move like this pawn push in bad conditions. And no other piece can really ever dream of kicking the knight away. So yeah, the knight becomes really an amazing piece. Now, black plays bishop b7, which you may think it's passive over here, but in the future it won't be so much. So after these pawns eventually push, and they will, the bishop will have a great diagonal. Of course, these aren't passed pawns, but I still think white should try to block them as if they were, because their advance can really be problematic, especially now that the bishop is on this diagonal, and you will see in a few moves what I mean. So white went for a rook lift, and this type of maneuver is all right, but we gotta be careful that our rook doesn't end up stuck in the corner of the board with not much to do. So the idea is to bring the rook and maybe eventually maneuver with the queen and create some attack on the king side, but yeah, not necessarily the most dangerous thing. It's also worth noting that here it's not easy to play as white. So the pawns can't move. Maybe you have to consider c4, but it may be premature, especially if black can simply reply by advancing. So even then we could simply ignore it. There isn't really an easy way to find a plan for white. Like, it seems like not only the pawn is blocked, it's like the entire position is blocked. So they went for this rook lift. Maybe even black even provoked the rook h3 and came back. No problems here. The rook is now doing next to nothing. And so white goes rook f1. The idea of rook f1 is, well, obviously we need to keep this pawn protected, and we can maybe in the future try to advance on the king side and open up some lines, right? So playing in opposite side castling style, even though the king is still here. Black plays rook e8. The idea is they want to have the rooks on the e and d file, preparing for an eventual advance, and also preparing for maybe a break on g5 that will leave this pawn weak, depending on the situation. So it's good to have a rook on e8. White plays rook f3, adding some more protection to the pawn. So rook d8, rook d1. Now black goes a6, so they don't really want to deal with a potential capture here. White now goes b4. The idea is now the queen can maybe reroute herself through a3, or maybe an a4, but yeah, a3 and bringing back into the game before just keep some more control of the weak squares. So if this bishop were to move, and black would really like to move the bishop maybe here and here, do something in the attack, then they don't really want to deal with a c5, right? That maybe if white went for it immediately, it would be a good response. So they want to keep the position, again, restricted for black by playing b4. And now black plays a great plan, which we already hinted before, which is to go for the g5 push. So king h8 is a great move. White routes the queen, and now rook g8, queen c3, trying to, well, give some defense to the pawn, and also if in case the position opens up, then yeah, the queen here in this diagonal could be dangerous. Rook g7, so no need to hurry, we can simply place both rooks. And now white played a move that is a mistake. And the thing is, black wants to play g5, so they want to turn this protected pass pawn into a weak pawn. And if white went to insist on protecting the pawn, then we can simply take, and we will have two rooks on an open file if these pawns were to disappear, right? So they try to stop that with bishop e3, and the proper way to stop it was bishop d3, so that after we push, this pawn is hanging, right? But sorry about those extra lines. White went bishop e3, and this does indeed stop g5, but what can black do now? So they play the move c5, which is just great. It liberates the bishop, because we're not gonna be happy with just c5. We're also gonna play d4 next, and the bishop will come back to life. Or, well, more like coming to life for the first time, because it did nothing the entire game. It was just sitting there, right? So the proper reaction here would have probably been to just take, and after this push, simply sacrifice the exchange, and at least white has a playable position because they've taken so many pawns, and they have the two bishops versus rook and knight. The rooks aren't really doing much now, so yeah, even if g5 came, then this bishop is putting a good safeguard on the king side. So yeah, this was a playable position. They could also take, sorry, if we go here, they could take with the bishop and now allow g5. And yeah, here they can defend with rook g3, giving the pawn back. And yeah, this is a position that is complex, but certainly still playable for white. So there were these two reasonable options. Instead here, white simply collapsed due to the threats. They brought the rook out of danger to this push. Keep in mind that the fork doesn't really work because the pawn is pinned to the queen. So yeah, maybe they thought they could get free of that. So black pushed. White simply moves the queen away and the bishop is safe. But yeah, the position has really improved for black. This is what I want you to realize. So the pawns could advance and release the bishop and create so many threats. Meanwhile, the white pawn is still blocked here, and the knight is still a great piece in its blocking position. So yeah, this is basically a masterclass in positional play, and here comes the next blow that is just amazing. What would you play here as black? So the great move that black play now is g5, completely crashing white's dreams and hopes here. The pawn cannot be taken because of f4. Black is threatening to take. There's just so much going on. But if you remember from the beginning, we said that this bishop is the only piece that could ever annoy this knight or threaten to take it. And now that this pawn has moved forward, that option exists. So white says, okay, I'm sick and tired of that knight, I'm gonna take it. And it's pinned, so we cannot really move. So yeah, they managed to take after this trade. And now bishop takes e2 is just crashing because well, the rook cannot take, and the king can't really take either because there's just so many threats. So there could even be a queen c6, right? So let's say white takes, now queen c6, and after these moves we can even take now with the rook, and this is going to be checkmate, right? So yeah, bishop takes d2. White refuses to take, but now we take back the bishop, and this position is crashing. Black is totally winning, right? Let's see how the game ended. So white took, bishop came back, takes, queen d5, c6 trying to defend, but yeah, we simply take, and you can see that black won with ease. Here white resigned. But as always, I don't really want to focus on the tactical details. Yeah, this final bishop c4 is interesting to consider because white gets to remove the blocker even though it's too late. But what I want to focus is first on the passed pawn and how we should block it, and how a knight is usually a great blocker when there's this locked center, and we can have influence with our knight on the opponent's side of the board. How we can use our blocker to help with breakthroughs, pawn breaks, and pushes on the sides from this great square. And also importantly, even though these weren't passed pawns, how yeah, white would really love to keep blocking these pawns instead of allowing the release of the pressure. Even though they aren't passed pawns, they still come on topic in this blocking chapter, right? So white really wants to block white really wants to block black's pawns, not just controlling the squares, because if we just control it, then we get into trouble like here, right? So yeah, we are controlling these two squares, but we are allowing potential sacrifices. So we don't want to let those sacrifices happen when they are dangerous and they can create attack, right? So we want to keep a pawn, keep a piece blocking the pawn. We don't want to allow any chances. Of course, there's concrete calculation, and if we are really certain that the advances are bad, then we can allow that chance. But usually, just for good measure, to be cautious, we want to block the opponent's dangerous pawns, more so if they are passed pawns, like here. But usually any pawns, weak pawns, using our weak squares, usually using all the principles of chess strategy that we learned. Okay, so let's conclude this chapter with a final exercise. So here we have this position, and it's white to move, and you can see that there's this bishop blocking the passed pawns. The rook is also controlling here, and the promotion square protecting the blocker. So what do we do? How do we play here as white? Okay, have you find it? Pause the video, try to not just see the idea, but also calculate the ultimate consequences of it. Okay, so yeah, maybe we want to move the rook along this file to stop the enemy king from coming into the game, into the part of the game that matters, to be more precise. But it's more important to remove this blocker. So in the previous example, the knight was an excellent blocker and the bishop wasn't that great of a blocker. But here is the opposite, because look at this bishop is really controlling all the squares the white king could use to enter the enemy position and help the pawns get pushed. So yeah, really the bishop is a great blocker here. And it's also, since the pawns are diagonally adjacent, the bishop is blocking one pawn and controlling the advance of the other. So what do we do as white? We remove the bishop, black has to take back, and now our king simply helps our pawns march forward. So, well, h7 is winning straight away, but king f5 is also winning. Even king h5 is winning too. Like this would be a very natural and elegant way to win. But of course, we can simply play h7, just winning directly, right? Okay, so keep in mind when we have passed pawns, if we get the choice of who gets to block them, make sure to make it. Sometimes the blocking side is the one who chooses, and they also gotta choose wisely. But I hope you enjoyed this chapter on passed pawns and on the blockade of passed pawns, and see you on the next one.